Sorry, I'm trying to figure out how to get my headphones on.
Good morning, everybody. Are there matters left over from last time having to do with the details of the course, or
Yeah, I'm trying to connect my earbuds.
what's that?
Oh, fuck's sake.
Having to do with the details of the course or the narrative? Any questions about what I've been saying? Very good. So I'd like to get more deeply into Ottoman history today. And we can begin by, I think, I'll start with this map. This is a timeline map. And it begins with the Roman Empire, way back at the end of the ancient world. You can see the Roman Empire. This is, say, the 4th century. And it covers Western Europe, but North Africa and the Middle East. And we're particularly interested in this area here today. This is the heart of the eastern part of the Roman Empire, which was largely Greek-speaking. And this area actually survived the barbarian invasions, the Germanic tribes, their invasions, and it continued right through the Middle Ages. But as this timeline indicates, I'll move it back. Here you can see this is we're deep in the Middle Ages now. Western Europe is overrun by the German tribes, and later on in Spain by the Arabs. But this part is surviving, and so it continues. And we see here we're again, it's still late in the Roman Empire. There it is, the East Roman Empire. It's still going. But lo and behold, in the late Middle Ages, what you find is, as a result of Turkish invasion, that it starts to shrink and gets smaller and smaller as the Turks move in. Until you can see now, look what it's reduced to. And meanwhile, the rest of Anatolia, this area here, is becoming Turk. And indeed, and the Turks, wretched music, the Turks eventually, basically, in 1453, overrun the Byzantine Empire. They take the last city, Constantinople. Just let me shut this down. How do I cut? Just hold on. Finally. Okay. So the Roman Empire survived in the East right through the Middle Ages, getting smaller and smaller, reduced to the city of Constantinople, and finally in 1453, Mehmed II, as I was explaining, who was the leader of the Ottoman Turks, and whose territory includes all of what is now Turkey, but also the Balkans, as well as, just a second. The Ottomans control Anatolia and the Balkans at this point under Mehmed II, and they've taken Constantinople in 1453. Now, as I was explaining last time, Mehmed II is really the founder of the Ottoman Empire, because, first of all, he does take the city of Constantinople. He assembles a huge fleet, which is interesting in itself. Plus, he has infantry and cannon, and he has Italian engineers who are helping him to develop and operate these new sophisticated armaments. So that's the first thing that he does. But unlike other Islamic conquerors who tended to sort of obliterate the cities that they took, Mehmed II has the idea that he's going to, instead of destroying Constantinople, he renames it as Istanbul, as the new Islamic Rome. He's founding a new Islamic Roman Empire, and he decides to rebuild the city as the center of the Ottoman Empire. So he takes Constantinople, he refounds the city. He has the huge army that he's assembled rebuild the walls and some of the main buildings of the city. He actually begins to repopulate the city. In 1453, there were only 80,000 people left. And what he does is that he orders people from the Balkans and from Anatolia to move, because he's an absolute ruler. He orders people to move into the city of Constantinople. And so the city, which had only 80,000 by the middle of the 16th century, less than a century later, it had a population of about 350,000 people. So the city of now Istanbul is rebuilt as the capital of his empire. Another point that I made last time is that whereas before the Ottoman territory in the Balkans and in Anatolia had been more or less loosely controlled, he now establishes a strong bureaucratic structure, centralized structure, which enables him to collect taxes and to obviously develop the state as a result. You can see how comparable this is to what is going on in Western Europe. There's the comparability in the process that we're seeing in the Ottoman Empire with the formation of the strong monarchies in the West. Now, another important aspect of Mehmed's rule is he dealt, obviously, this is a Islamic State, jihad, or Islamic crusade against the infidels is fundamental to this, the whole conception of the state, conquering for Islam, the same way as the Spaniards conquer for the Catholic Church. That's all true, but his policy, which is in line with previous Arab empires, is that he's actually tolerant towards the subordinated populations. The subordinate populations being, of course, Christians and Jews. I first want to deal with the Jewish population, because one of the things that Muhammad II does is, here I think I need to go back and okay, here are the Jews on the screen. And within the Ottoman Empire, which, by the way, is about to sort of dramatically expand, as we'll see, many Jews already live. They're amongst the sort of East Roman population. There were already Jews living in Constantinople and some of the other territories. These people were called Romani. And then when the Ottoman Empire expanded into the Arab lands, as we'll see in a few minutes, that is to say, into Syria, into Palestine, into Egypt, into Iraq, likewise, there were many Jews whose culture was basically Arab. So you have in the Ottoman Empire essentially a Romani, who are basically Greek-speaking. You have Arabs. But then Mehmed makes a point of inviting Jews who are fleeing from Spain, and they begin to leave in the course of the 15th century and leave dramatically in large numbers, hundreds of thousands, when they're expelled from Spain in 1492. He invites many of the Jews from Spain. These are called Sephardic Jews, to basically move to the Ottoman Empire. So they moved to Constantinople, they moved to Greece and the Balkans, they move into North Africa, which is becoming part of the Ottoman Empire. And then even Jews from the Ukraine and from Germany, these Eastern European Jews who are also being persecuted, he starts to invite them to take refuge. Why is he doing this? Well, because the Jews, the top layer of the Jews, are rich merchants and bankers. But also there's a lot of skilled artisans amongst the Jews. The Jewish community, the top level are these merchants. But below them, the great majority of them are craftsmen. And they know how to produce things like textiles. And so there is an enrichment of the Ottoman Empire by the influx of this Jewish population. And as the Ottoman Empire continues, the Jews become important to the economic life of the Ottoman Empire. And both as merchants and as artisans, manufacturing things like especially textiles, but other things. They're jewelers, they're goldsmiths, they're silversmiths. They make a lot of stuff that the Ottomans value or can be sold. So there is this reality of essentially an Ottoman Empire, but the Jews, although their population is perhaps several 100,000, maybe a million at the maximum. They do play an important role in the Ottoman Empire. And I mentioned this. This is important, of course, because the point I'm essentially getting at is that there was this coexistence between the Muslims and the Jews, unlike today. That's the point. We tend to think of the sort of hostility between Islam, Arabs, and the Jews as somehow this has gone on forever, but that's not true. During the Ottoman Empire, although the Jews clearly were an inferior group and they had to pay a special tax, they coexisted and were sort of assimilated into the culture of the Middle East. So that's one group. Now, a second group that Mehmed also cultivated were the Greeks, who were Christians. They were members of the Greek Orthodox Church. They had a patriarch who was the leader of the patriarch of Constantinople, was the head of the church. Well, again, this is an Islamic empire. The Greeks who had basically made up the population in the Eastern Roman Empire, including the Balkans, much of the Balkans, and in Anatolia, now were under Islam. And they found a place. They also had to pay tax, special religious tax, but they were tolerated. And they also found a place within the Ottoman Empire. What place? Well, the Greeks were also merchants alongside the Jews, but they were also, of course, they were a people of the sea. They were fishermen and they were merchant mariners. Coastal trade and maritime commerce was an essential part of Greek culture. And so under the Ottomans, the maritime commerce and indeed the Navy was largely staffed by Greeks. And so that was their role. And they, of course, were far more populous than were the Jews. We'll come back to some of the other peoples in a few minutes. But I would say that the Jews and the Greeks, and maybe we could also include the Armenians, made up the merchant class in the Ottoman Empire. Are there any questions about what I've said? Now, that being the case, a point has to be made here. The Ottomans were warriors. They ultimately became a sort of landed warrior class. And they were not interested in commerce. The commerce and the sort of manufacturing activity were left to the subordinated people, the Jews, the Greeks, the others. But this was politically a sort of significant thing because whereas in Europe, say in the Kingdom of France or in the Kingdom of England, the merchant class were part of what they were English or they were French, which meant that as the merchant class developed in Europe, as capitalism developed, they developed a kind of social and political agenda of their own. And ultimately, they began to rival the sort of landlord class and the power of the king, as we, of course, we're going to see more and more. But in the Ottoman Empire, this really never happened because these groups belonged to different, the merchants belonged to a different sort of ethnic and religious communities that could not really rival the dominant Ottoman sort of landlord warrior element. And so that dynamic, which we see in Western Europe, of the sort of development of the merchant class, the development of capitalism, and so on. It's not present in the Ottoman Empire. Added to which, of course, the Sultan is so powerful that the opportunity for merchants to sort of politically rival the power of the Sultan and the dominant Ottoman landlords, that's not possible. Yeah. So what I'm saying is the Ottoman Empire, there is a kind of stability, or we could say a lack of dynamism within, from a social point of view, that we do not see in Western Europe. Are there any questions about what I've just said?
So the reason that the Ottoman Empire didn't transition to capitalism is because the merchants and the tradespeople who were trying to push towards a capitalist system didn't have enough, didn't have the people behind them.
They didn't have the people, but also they had the state. They had this special status, but they were essentially sort of discriminated against because they were Jews or Christians. And what could they do? They were sort of subordinated. So the sort of religious state, the Islamic religious state, controlled them. To say nothing of which, even the state controlled the marketplace very strongly. Wages and prices, everything was regulated. There was no tendency to develop a kind of free market within this system. It was state controlled from the top. You see, it's a different sort of setup, and the state and the religion are one and the same thing. So the development of capitalist tendencies, and there were such tendencies, but they are completely checked and subordinated within the Ottoman state. Any other people have any questions that they wish to raise? I'm glad that you make that point.
I just want to clarify really quick. The Byzantine Empire and the Eastern Roman Empire are the same thing?
They are.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, it's one and the same thing. Yes, there's a confusion about that. I don't want to get bogged down in discussing the term Byzantine. It refers to a small town in Greece. Well, so to sum up Mehmed II, the establishment of a bureaucracy, the conquest of Constantinople, its repopulation, and then the kind of establishment of these relationships of a kind of toleration of the Christian and the Jewish communities. These are the basic accomplishments of Mehmed II. The next ruler who draws our attention the next ruler who draws our attention is Selim I, 1512 to 1520. And why is he important? Because it's under this Sultan that the Ottoman Empire, which is still basically confined to Anatolia and the Balkans, it now conquers the Arab countries. The Arab Middle East is conquered under Selim I. I'm talking about Syria, I'm talking about Palestine, I'm talking about Egypt. This is where the Arab population is concentrated. And basically the occasion for this conquest is that these areas, which are Arab populated, are ruled by weak government. The government in Syria, the government in Egypt is very weak. I'm not going to sort of, this was sort of old, sort of Turkish sort of elites that had moved into this area, and this had become very decadent. These are the so-called Mamelukes, and I'm not going to explain what they are because it's not important. The main thing is that Selim I realized that these areas, which of course were very rich, were politically very weak. And he realized that, as a matter of fact, the neighboring empire, the Persian Empire, which I explained this is modern Iran, the Persian Empire was also quite interested in moving into these areas. So what I'm basically saying is that the Arab lands, Syria, Palestine, Lebanon, Egypt, were being eyeballed by the Ottoman Empire on the one hand, and the Persian Empire, which was by its side. And a war broke out between these two empires. Now, we should note that these two empires, the Ottoman Empire and the Persian, were actually religious rivals. And here we come to this distinction between two kinds of Islam. The Ottoman Empire was Sunni. This goes way back to the 8th century. The Iranian Empire was Shia. So the Persian Empire to the east, the Ottoman Empire to the west, Sunni. The Iranian sort of Persian Empire to the east is Shia. What's the difference? The difference is that Sunni Islam is based on a kind of strict legal interpretation of the Quran, the holy book. The scholars the imams who interpret Islam and who advise the Sultan, basically they base everything on sort of legal precedents that are drawn from the Quran. The Shias are different. Of course, they depend on the Quran, but there's a great deal more in the way of sort of free interpretation. There are mystics in Shia Islam. There are saints, special holy men in Shia Islam who are recognized as having special spiritual authority. And sort of the leadership of these clergy who are endowed with powerful religious strength are also very important. Now, this rivalry, which developed in the 8th and 9th century, continued right into the present. Sorry, into the 16th century. And so it's partly underlying this is a kind of the ethnic difference between Persians, or if you like, modern day Iranians, and these other people, the Turks and the Arabs. But nevertheless, there are these differences. And in any case, what happened, there was a big battle in 1512, and the Ottomans defeated the Persians and proceeded to invade and conquer these Arab lands. Sorry, the year I gave you is wrong. It's 1514. So under Selim, the Ottoman Empire takes over the Arab lands. And indeed, eventually, not only did they take over Egypt and Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, but the Ottomans move into the Arabian Peninsula and seize the holy city of Mecca. So the Ottoman Empire includes the holy city of Mecca. The Sultan, of course, is the religious head, but of course, to the Islamic world, Mecca is absolutely, it's like Jerusalem or Rome for the Jews and the Christians. So this is all, yes, it's all very important. Yes.
The Ottomans are the Sunni?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, got it. Sorry, I got the two confused.
Yes, and why am I belaboring this? Why am I? Because it's important even now. These people, the Sunni and the Shia, they are still at loggerheads. They're still arguing, and the Iranians, who are Shia, and Iran is a religious state. The Shia rule there. For example, they don't get along with Saudi Arabia, which is the richest of the Sunni countries. And the Saudi Arabians try to subvert Iran with the help of the Americans. The Iranians are lined up with other Shia groups in Syria and Lebanon. And there's a perpetual civil war in the Middle East between these two groups. So what I'm saying is, in terms of your sort of understanding of this world that we're living in, sort of understanding that there is this tension between Shia and Sunni is an important thing for you to know. That's why I put a stress on this. Is there further questions about this? Because it's so significant.
Yeah, sorry. I was just wondering who you said that in 1514 the Ottomans seized Mecca. Who they seize Mecca from? Who was ruling Mecca?
Well, these Arabs. They took over from the Arabs and subordinated the Arabs.
Okay.
So the main thing is Salim. He takes over the Arab Middle East, all these countries. Now, this brings me to the last point about this. You should understand that the Ottomans are a kind of aristocracy. They have land which is given to them by the Sultan. By the way, the landlords who are mainly Turks, they don't have their land unconditionally. In the West, what I'm trying to say is that property rights are pretty strong. Even the sort of the landlords in England and France, they are certainly, the old feudal system is still the basis legally, but practically speaking, landlords in the West have considerable property rights, and stable property rights are important to capitalism. I don't have to explain that to you. Full rights to property are fundamental in a capitalist society. In the Ottoman Empire, theoretically, and I'm saying this theoretically, everything belongs to the Sultan. All property belongs to the Sultan. I mean, this is in theory. Of course, in practice, people have their land, landlords are collecting rents, and merchants have their property, the artisans have their property, but in theory, in law, property rights are quite weak. In any case, so that's an additional point we could make, but I want to talk a little bit about the relationship between the Turks and the Arabs. Both the Turks and the Arabs are Muslims, of course, and the Turks have now conquered the Arab land. But it should be understood that the Arabs are considered by the Turks as inferior to themselves. The Turks are the rulers, and the Ottoman Empire is ruled by the Turks. Nevertheless, we could say that the Arabs, who are subordinate because they're Muslims, they have a better place than the Christians or the Jews. And as a matter of fact, if there's an ambitious Arab, say a landlord family in Egypt, who wants to make their way in the world, they Turkify themselves. They become Turkish. They adopt Turkish ways, I'm saying. And over several generations, it's possible for a powerful Arab family to become sort of assimilated to the Ottomans and to more or less join the Ottoman elite. I'm sort of trying to explain the dynamic here. This is the way it worked. So the Ottomans are at the top. They are the warriors. They hold the lands conditionally under the Sultan. And then there's sort of the Arabs are sort of underneath them. And then come the Christians, and I would say at the bottom are the Jews. That's the setup in the Ottoman Empire. Well, Selim, therefore, after Mehmed II, we could say is the second important sultan of this period. But finally, we come to the greatest of these people, the developers of the Ottoman Empire. And this is, of course, Suleiman the Magnificent, 1520 to 1566. So why is he magnificent? Because he basically greatly expands the Ottoman Empire, brings it to its height. And when I say that, of course, let me what I'm trying to do now is bring up a map of the there we have back to that map. And this is the shape of the Ottoman Empire at the end of the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent. You can see that it starts with Anatolia, present-day Turkey, and the Balkans. Selim takes over these Arab lands. You can see here. Here's the Persian Empire off to the east, these Arab lands. But Suleiman expands the Ottoman Empire all across North Africa. And also, he expands the Ottoman Empire in the north, almost to the gates of Vienna, deep into Europe. And also, we should say that Suleiman also conquers Iraq from the Persians, 1535. So Suleiman takes over North Africa, he expands into the Balkans and as far away as Hungary, gates of Vienna, and he takes over Iraq. And I would say of these conquests, the most important is Iraq, because Iraq is sitting in this extremely fertile. Iraq is very fertile and rich, and it's a huge. It's hugely reinforcing to the strength of the Ottoman Empire. And of course, these areas are contested even today. I mean, I'm not going to get into it, but I mean, the Americans, of course, there's great wealth here. of course, eventually there's oil wealth. And of course, I want to emphasize Mesopotamia is the cradle of Middle Eastern European civilization. So Iraq is very important. In any case, let's talk a little bit about the Ottoman expansion under Solomon to the gates of Vienna. Now, I explained that the jihad crusade is fundamental, and fighting the Christians, this has been going on since the time of Muhammad, and so it continues. And in 1528, Solomon organizes this vast army, hundreds of thousands of troops. They march against the Christians and establish a siege of Vienna. The siege of Vienna of 1529. Charles V has to leave Spain and organize the defense of Vienna, and he's able to get a certain amount of cooperation. But his problem is that the Luther and the Lutheran Reformation has broken out in Germany. Some of the German princes who have become Lutherans refuse to send soldiers. So there are difficulties. Nevertheless, Charles V, the Ottomans turn out to be overextended. It's too far based on the logistics. And so the Ottomans have to sort of retreat. And basically, they remain in parts of Hungary. Hungary becomes the no man's land between the West Europeans or the Europeans and the Turks. Right through until the 18th century, this area, Hungary, is basically fought over between the Turks and the Habsburgs, the Austrians, the Habsburgs. The descendants of Charles V are still fighting the Turks in Hungary into the 18th century. That becomes the sort of frontier. Now, that's one front, but I want to say that another aspect of this is very important is, of course, the fighting in the Mediterranean, because we saw that the Mehmed and his successors, including Solomon the Magnificent, they established a relationship with the Greek population. And the Greeks were sailors, they were merchant mariners, and they became the sort of the navy force of the Ottoman Empire. Under Ottoman colors, the Ottoman Navy was largely staffed by these Greeks. And when I speak about a navy, it was a navy based on galleys. These were not sailing ships like the Europeans were developing over in Spain and in Portugal and France and England. These are not ocean-going sailing vessels, they're galley ships. Rowed, that there are sails, but they're rowed as well. And they're much smaller. But nevertheless, it's the Greeks that are operating them. And there's a continuous warfare in the Mediterranean. And it's partly a kind of commercial war between these Greek-speaking people and the Venetians and the West Europeans for control over the Mediterranean Sea and for control over the trade routes into the Middle East and beyond into India. So this is the situation, but it becomes complicated politically because, as a matter of fact, Charles V is fighting. He's concerned about the Ottomans up in trying to take Vienna. but Charles V's greatest rival is the King of France. And what does the King of France, Francis I? I did my PhD thesis on Francis I, especially his sister, Margaret, who's a very interesting woman, an incredible poet and sort of religious thinker. In any case, I'm not going to get off on that. But anyway, this Sir Francis I, he's a reader of Machiavelli. He knows the prince. And he realizes that Charles V, unless Charles V is somehow stopped, if he's victorious against the Ottomans, he puts down the Lutherans. France is next. France will be conquered by Charles V. So what does he do? He makes an alliance in 1528 with the Sultan and opens up the port of Marseille to the Ottoman Navy. Now, this is incredible because it had never happened before.
When is the alliance made?
1528.
And sorry, the alliance is between the Sultan and Francis
King
I?
Yes, the King of France. Now, this is the destruction of the unity of Christendom. This is total political expediency. This is the prince in action. So you can see what's happening here. And I would say from this point onwards, the French have this special relationship with the Sultan in Constantinople. As a result of this continuing alliance, the French are able to develop all kinds of commercial and political relationships with the Ottoman Empire. And what we see is that in particular, the French established themselves in Lebanon and on the coast of Syria. And these, the French, as I say, they developed this kind of commercial political relationship. And eventually, as some of you may know, Lebanon and Syria become colonies of France. So this is the beginning. Eventually, as the Ottoman Empire decays, the French move in. And this has, in terms of understanding the dynamic of European colonialism, it's an important aspect of things. Questions? Okay, the last point I want to make is about the Venetians. Now, the Venetians had been during the Middle Ages and still at the beginning of the 16th century. Venice is up here. It's a merchant republic. And why were the Venetians so important? Because they basically controlled the whole of the traditional Mediterranean Near Eastern trade with the Middle East and India. And they were still there. And so they were, of course, their interest was keep the Ottomans, keep these Greek merchants, keep these Ottomans out. And so we do see that the Venetians are fighting the Ottomans all the way from 1453 onwards. But at the same time, as I explained, in the end, they also have to get along with these people because the Ottomans ultimately are in control of the Middle East. If the Venetians want to trade in the Middle East and with India, they have to sort of make some arrangement. So it's a kind of peculiar relationship between Venice and the Ottoman Empire. And there's ongoing tension. Sometimes there's war, but sometimes they make alliances. In particular, when the Portuguese basically discovered the all-water route, then the Venetians, they want to be friends with the Ottomans because they want to preserve the Mediterranean. They want to preserve access to the Middle East. They want to preserve their sort of what they had been the monopoly in the trade with the Far East, with India and with China. And so it was that the Venetians actually helped Suleiman the Magnificent in 1535 when Suleiman established a fleet at the head of the Persian Gulf here and broke through, and they broke through and opened up. The Portuguese were trying to close the Persian Gulf, and the Venetians and the Ottomans cooperated in opening it up. And I would say that, as a matter of fact, this trade route remained
The
important.
Venetians and the Ottomans cooperated on opening up what?
The Persian Gulf. The Portuguese were trying to close it because they wanted to basically block this trade, and they wanted a monopoly. The Portuguese in India wanted a monopoly on the trade in spices and silks and so on. And the Ottomans and the Venetians were forced into this collaboration in order to make sure that that didn't happen. And so what I would say is this trade route across the Mediterranean remained still the most important until about 1580. In other words, yes, I made a big thing of the Portuguese opening of India, but you should realize that it wasn't until around 1580 that the all-water route to Asia became the dominant route from that point onward. 1580, right through the 16th century, at the height of Suleiman the Magnificent, part of his magnificence was economic prosperity based on the continuation of this trade route. Now, I want to say a final thing about the Venetians. The Venetians hated the Greeks, and the Greeks hated the Venetians because there were commercial rivalries. But also, the Venetians had no love for the Jews either, because the Jews were now active in the Ottoman Empire. They were merchants and so on. Some of them showed up in Venice. There is, as a matter of fact, a famous play based on the rivalry, these commercial rivalries I'm talking about. Shakespeare wrote a famous play about this. Does anybody know the name of that play? The Merchant of Venice, which is all about this rich Jew in Venice, and the sort of fights and rivalries become extremely personal. It's all about the context that I'm talking about. Are there any questions about what I've said so far this morning? Oh, I'm sorry, I've overstayed, and we'll resume next time.
Thanks, Professor.
Thank you.